Welcome to Self-Care for Sleep Professionals, presented by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. I'm your host, Thomas Heffron, and I thank you for joining us today for this live webinar. Our presenter is Dr. Emerson Wickwire, who's chair of the Academy's Sleep Psychologist Assembly. Dr. Wickwire is an associate professor of psychiatry and medicine at the University of Maryland School of Medicine and director of the Insomnia Program at the University of Maryland Medical Center. Dr. Wickwire is also an award-winning educator and has an active research portfolio with more than $4 million in grants and contracts focused on sleep health economics, as well as remote monitoring and telehealth. We're grateful to Dr. Wickwire for proposing today's webinar. We appreciate this opportunity to connect sleep professionals during this unusual time of social distancing. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for free on the Academy website at aasm.org. During the presentation, I encourage you to use the chat feature to engage with other attendees, and you can use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. Following the presentation, we'll use these questions for a Q&A session with Dr. Wickwire. Now, let's begin Self-Care for Sleep Professionals with Dr. Emerson Wickwire.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thomas, can you hear me okay?
Yep, you sound good.
Perfect. Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody. I am here in my home office. I've been teleworking for about a month. In Maryland, we're now officially in shelter in place. My wife is upstairs. She's also teleworking. We're now running an N of 1 kindergarten homeschool here for our son, who's been an absolute trooper and joy. His Lego skills are rapidly advancing, frankly, even surpassing a pretty strong baseline. So whether you're at home or at work, welcome. I'm glad you've joined us. 4 weeks ago, we had our regular faculty meeting in the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine, where the Sleep Disorder Center is housed and where I work. Unlike most monthly meetings that are partially attended, this was a required mandatory meeting. Everybody was there. Given that my pulmonary and critical care colleagues run the ICU at our tertiary academic medical center, you can imagine the content of that meeting. It was a planning meeting in preparation for an expected surge of COVID-19 cases. So we discussed patient care and equipment and fittings and information and logistics and billing and documentation and so on. Now, at that meeting, two things happened that greatly impressed and inspired me, and I'd like to share them with you today. The first is that one of our colleagues was in Grenada at the time, and this was an in-person meeting. He remotely videoed in, actually by Zoom, just like we are today, and you could see his hotel room in the background. He was uncertain about being able to return to the US because at that time international travel was quite uncertain. And he had been away from his wife and children, school-age children, for longer than he hoped. And as the meeting went on, people chimed in and we got to a time when we were asking questions. And his colleague's comment was, "Come on, guys, this is what we trained for. We can step up and do this." That is positive leadership. And I texted my support right away. 5 minutes after the meeting ended, my phone rang. It was another colleague asking me to partner with her and design a study to look at the psychological and sleep-related impact of COVID-19 on healthcare workers. And within 3 days, we had an IRB-approved serial assessment survey study up and running, which as of yesterday, we have 280 participants. That is positive initiative. So regardless of your work setting, I suspect that you too, over the past weeks, have experienced examples of positive leadership and positive initiative, and perhaps these events have had a similar impact on you as they did on me. So it was in the spirit of having been deeply impressed and inspired by my colleagues, by their leadership and by their initiative in the face of these challenges, that I reached out to several AASM friends and then directly to Steve Van Hout who was immediately and strongly supportive of this webinar today. My only request was that the webinar would be offered at no charge. So please, if you find value in the presentation today, consider a gift to the AASM Foundation or your favorite local charity. At the very least, continue to pay your helpers if you have them, and the people who really help make your life run. Be generous where you can, because good people are going to need your help. Now, the theme of the presentation today is bounce back and spring forward. It's not enough simply to return to baseline for us as individuals and frankly for us as a field of sleep medicine. So I want to focus not only on getting back to where we were, whether that's in weeks or months, but also in how we can move ourselves and our collective important work forward. Briefly, I'll touch base on three things. The first is maintaining perspective. The second is taking care of yourself. And the third is continuing our important work by staying engaged. When we have uncertain shores, the metaphor that I want to share with you to maintain perspective is a lot like swimming. And when you swim in open water, most of our time is spent face down. And only every so often do we check in to look forward and make sure that we're still heading in the right direction towards the lighthouse, as it were. So when we talk about maintaining perspective, remember that most of our work is done with our boots on the ground. And that doesn't mean we only want to stare at our toes, but it does mean that we need to keep our eyes focused on the lighthouse ahead of us. Using the chat function, I'd like to ask if anyone recognizes this animal. Please go ahead and chime in if you have any suggestions. Excellent. Yes, horse, good, thanks for keen sense of the obvious. And someone here wins a prize, Marietta Bibbs and perhaps others. This is Seabiscuit. You may have read a wonderful historical novel about Seabiscuit. You may have seen a film about Seabiscuit. This was an undersized champion horse in the Depression era who really had a remarkable string of victories. And what I want to impress upon you when we talk about self-care is that if you own a champion animal like this, I am quite certain that we would focus on things like keeping it well rested, keeping it well fed, and keeping it fit. These are exactly the same kinds of principles that will help us move through this challenging time. Let's talk a little bit about stress physiology in the context of maintaining perspective and taking care of ourselves and staying engaged. And what this line represents is essentially our stress system. Now, there are robust literatures looking at stress physiology in a number of disease states, including among healthy individuals. So when I talk about stress, we can talk about respiratory rate or pupillometry or cardiovascular measures, heart rate variability. We can talk about hormonal balance and things like stress hormones and cortisol. I'm lumping all those together now and just saying this is your stress system in a relaxed state. Now, when a threat is perceived, when we perceive danger in the environment, as if you've been alive on planet Earth in the past month, you have, what we want is a robust and powerful engagement. We want our stress system to engage. These are short-term stress hormones, adrenaline, and so forth. Now, equally important is that we experience a rapid disengagement once we have achieved safety. This is evolutionary, just like the need for sleep is evolutionary. Now, in a healthy stress response system, that curve is defined by a powerful, robust engagement and an efficient disengagement with a rapid return to baseline. With chronic stress exposure, oftentimes what we see is a flattened response curve. So you'll notice that the two differences in this slide are that no longer do we have a robust, powerful engagement. In other words, the upward line is not nearly as steep, and no longer do we have an efficient and effective disengagement. In other words, the downward line is no longer as steep. So instead what we have is chronic inflammation, a chronic activation of the stress system that can manifest itself in a number of different ways. For some patients, this is cognitive perseveration or worry. For other patients, this might be chronic pain. For others, this might be depressed mood. All of these chronic conditions really manifest very similar biological footprints. And this is what we're trying to avoid. So the first thing that we need to do in order to avoid that is to relax our body. And what I'd like you to do now, sitting right where you are, is close your eyes. Nobody's looking. The camera's only one way. Take 3 seconds and see where you feel the tension in your body. And please go ahead and using the chat feature, let me know, where do you feel the tension in your body? Excellent. So far, every response is the neck up. So we have shoulders, neck, head, it's all upper body. And what I'd like you to do next are take 3 deep breaths. I'm going to teach a technique called the cooling breath. To me, managing or reducing stress in the moment is all about cooling down that inflammation that we talked about earlier. So what we're going to do here is simply inhale deeply. And although this is a lovely photo, I actually want you inhaling into your belly button, not into your sternum. So we're going to use deep diaphragmatic muscles that perhaps don't get used as often as they should. And we're going to take 3 breaths, simply inhaling for a count of 4 and exhaling slowly for a count of 8. If that breathing rhythm is difficult for you, then you can cut that in half to inhale for 2 and exhale for 4. We're just going to take 3 breaths. And while you're exhaling, I want you to focus on releasing tension in just that body part that you identified a moment ago. So we'll inhale for a count of 4. And we'll exhale for a count of 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Same thing, 2 more breaths on your own. Inhale for a count of 4. Exhale for a count of 8. 1 more. Inhale for a count of 4. Exhale for a count of 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And what I'd like you to do now, please, is, again, using the chat feature, just let me know how you feel. How's the stress? I have a neck feels better already. Thank you, Linda Murphy. Kathleen Gallagher, more relaxed, less in the back. Excellent. There are almost 1,000 attendees on the webinar today, which is a testament to our community, and the positive comments are flying in. I really appreciate that. Tension is the #1 performance killer. It's the #1 performance killer in athletics. It's the #1 performance killer in our professional lives. Tension results in a loss of flexibility, and now more than ever, this is a time when we need to stay flexible. I once asked my grandmother, who was a resilient woman in her own right, a remarkably resilient woman in her own right. I said, Mimi, how have you lived your life this way? What are your words of wisdom to me? And she said, you need to be able to adapt and adjust. And being able to adapt and adjust requires flexibility. It means that we can be nimble. So one theme that I want you to think about, that all of us need to think about in terms of our self-care, is the ability to remain nimble. It's also worth mentioning for healthcare providers on the call that the loss of flexibility is really associated with all of those chronic disease states that we mentioned earlier. For example, in chronic depressive conditions, we have a loss of flexibility of affect. In other words, our emotions become very restricted in range and focusing on negative emotion and negative affect. When we talk about chronic anxiety, that is characterized by a loss of flexibility in the way that we think, and we ruminate and we worry. And all of those things are very easy to be doing these days. And it's important to break those patterns of inflexibility. If you think about chronic pain or even physical aging, all of these conditions are reflected in a loss of flexibility, where our bodies move less than they used to. If you've been alive on planet Earth, you have experienced worry. It's palpable, it's in the air in the past several weeks, and one of the self-care strategies that I'd like to share is how to reduce that worry. Now, worry, particularly free-floating worry, is caused in part by the physiology that we mentioned earlier. It's also caused in part by fear. Anxiousness and worry are signs of fear, and worry thrives in the dark. And what I mean by that is it thrives with uncertainty. Vague worry bounces around between our ears, just finding ideas to latch onto. So the way that we reduce worry is to turn on the lights and get very specific and name your fear. So one thing I'd like you to do, make sure that you have a piece of paper pulled out and jot that down. If you've experienced worry, jot it down what you might be afraid of. For example, I'm afraid of lost income. There are sleep technologists and other non-doctoral level providers, administrators and so forth on the call who maybe feel like our sleep disorder center might go belly up during this time, and I don't know what I'm going to do if I lose income for my family. So we want to move from the general to the specific. Now, the second thing that we're going to do is get really clear about what it is that we want. And in this instance, we want to dial it down. We want to feel less afraid. So for example, my objective here is to feel less afraid or less worried about my loss of income. You can be doing all of this on a piece of paper as we move forward. And of course, you can continue this after the call is over. So once I know that my objective is to feel less afraid about loss of income or any other fear that I might have, next thing that I want to do is cast a very, very wide net. I don't want to evaluate what are good ideas or bad ideas. I just want to generate ideas for ways that might make me feel less afraid. So if the objective is to feel less afraid, the next step is to generate and brainstorm alternatives that would help me feel less afraid. For example, one, I might want to talk to my financial planner. Two, depending on where you are, I might want to look at government support programs that will be emerging during this time. Three, I might want to talk to my boss and express my concerns and let my boss know that I'm willing to step up in any possible way to help support the mission, and so forth. Generate alternatives. And generally, what we experience just by the very fact that we've now made our vague fear very specific, that we've clarified that we want to dial down that fear, and we've begun to generate possible strategies that would make me feel less afraid, the anxiousness already begins to decrease. Now, we want to evaluate the pros, cons, and risks of each of those alternatives. That's a separate step than generating the alternatives themselves. And then finally, we want to take action here. So that might mean look up your local SBA, Small Business Association programs, and so forth. This photograph is of a woman named Carol Semple Thompson. Perhaps some of you have heard of her, but it's more likely that you haven't. And I'd like to tell you a bit about Carol and the lesson that she once taught me. Carol is the most successful amateur woman golfer in the history of the United States. She's the only amateur golfer ever to win the British Amateur Open and the US Amateur Open in the same year, which was 1973. She played on 12 Davis Cup teams and also was a non-playing captain on 2 additional Davis Cup teams. And she is one of the most soft-spoken, truly humble people that you've ever met. And as a young man, when I was coaching high school wrestling, which was my first love before I went to graduate school in sports psychology and stumbled into sleep medicine, I asked Carol once if I could buy her lunch and talk to her a little bit about her athletic success. Now, at the time, I was very well versed in the sport and performance research and sport and performance literature. And at that time, I thought that I'd be working in a performance coaching capacity for my career with athletes and executives and so on. And this was around the year 2000. And what Carol told me was that in the early 1970s, she worked with what we now call a sports psychologist, although he didn't have that credential, in a very profoundly deep way, especially 30 years ahead of the scientific curve, regarding strategies like visualization and emotional management and some of the ideas that we're talking about today. And Carol told me, that the number one key to her athletic success was the ability to block out negative thoughts. That when she was on the golf course, she wouldn't have, prior to a shot, even the possibility of shanking it out of bounds. It wouldn't enter her head. And that was the key skill that she had developed. It was to block those negative thoughts. Now, these days, negative thoughts may originate between our ears, but they also very often come to us from external sources. So it's important that we all stay abreast of what's going on during this time of crisis, but it's also important that we minimize the unsolicited negative input that's coming from 24-hour news and the internet. I was talking not long ago with a dear friend, someone who's been friends for 30 years. He's a Harvard alum and does not lack in intelligence. And he was mildly panicked about the possibilities of COVID-19. And I asked him, where are you hearing this information? Because the things that he was saying weren't true. And the first word out of his mouth was Facebook. And stop that. Cut off those negative influences. We all need to do that. Because the news employs very smart, well-paid people. Their job is to engage and enrage you. So only gather information from trusted sources. The second thing that we need to do is to practice positive self-talk. Once we dial down the negative, we need to replace that void. We need to fill that void with the positive. And this may simply be thinking of situations where you've overcome challenging barriers in the past, or remembering that you are not alone. In all likelihood, you're part of many communities. We have 1,000 people on a webinar during the work week now. You're certainly a member of a sleep community. Practicing self-talk, maybe simply letting yourself know that you're going to make it through this. So we want to dial down worry. We want to prevent unsolicited input, negative input, and we want to replace that with positive self-talk. I'd like to talk a bit about rituals to manage our arousal. And many of us spend most of our time in the busy phase. And I'm going to use a sleep-focused example here, but I think that you'll immediately be able to see how we can apply similar ideas to our 24-hour day. And working at home, as I am, and as many of you are, but not everybody, of course, working at home, it's very easy to let our day extend too long. And the way to cut that off is to create a ritual. So for example, I'm going to shut off my email. And all busy daytime activities, I'm going to stop before I shut off my email for the evening. This is going to help me enter a new phase of the day, Perhaps this is from 5 to 9 at night or 6 to 9 at night, whatever your schedule is, that I'm here calling unwind. And now I need to end unwind, so I'm going to turn off the TV. And this is now my pre-sleep period, where I'm going to change and brush my teeth and so on and so forth. And again, brushing the teeth is going to be the ritual that now is when I go and enter the bedroom and get in bed. So one of the ideas that I want to share is to create boundaries for different parts of your day, to intentionally focus on your arousal and emotional management rather than just pushing everything through and hammering away for 18 or 20 hours. We've talked a bit about the physical, we've talked a bit about the mental. I'd like to spend some time talking about the emotional. And I'm going to give you 3 ways to increase positive emotion. Practically and clinically, by that I mean in my work with, in a consulting capacity or in a clinical capacity or in a scientific capacity, affect is greatly unappreciated. Positive affect are underappreciated. Positive affect is a central resiliency determinant in my experience. There's an entire field called positive psychology, which focuses on not just negative experiences like depression or anxiety, but also positive experiences like optimism and resilience and gratitude and focusing on our individual strengths. And I'll touch base on that more in just a sec. But the concept here is what's called broaden and build. This is a core tenet of positive psychology developed by Dr. Barbara Fredrickson, a psychologist at the University of North Carolina. It's been applied in clinical health settings, educational settings, organizational settings. And the idea is that even a small experience of positive affect will change not only my emotional experience in the moment, but also the way I'm thinking and the way that I'm behaving. So our job is not to become a Zen monk overnight. It's just to take one small step that's going to have trickle-down feelings. And the first step that I'd like to suggest is that we focus on what actually is. Worry is all about what if, and what if is an adaptive life skill we've evolved to surveil our environments, and that's good. Otherwise, we've been gobbled up by the dinosaurs. However, it's also not helpful. And what is helps us or distracts us with all of the catastrophic scenarios that we can envision. What I'd like to do now is let's just take 30 seconds and using 3 senses other than sight, describe where you are. You can use the chat function. You can write this down. You can write this down on your paper. Using 3 senses, describe where you are. What do you hear? Are there any smells or tastes? What do you feel? If you're standing, what do you feel in your feet? If you're sitting, what do you feel in your legs? Where do you feel your clothes touching your body? The ability to focus in the moment reduces stress and increases what we would call flow. The one other thing that I'll mention when we talk about mindfulness kinds of approaches is the behavioral reinforcement of mindfulness-based approaches. As a behaviorist, my belief is that humans respond to the environment. That's what changes behavior. And when we are fully present in the moment, it increases the salience of our experiences so that we can more fully feel those positive effects. Second, we're going to write a gratitude list. It's a very powerful strategy, and I'd like you please to do this on the paper that you have in front of you. we're going to write down several things for which we are grateful. They don't have to be big things, they can be small things. I'll give you some examples. I'm grateful for the quiet time that I had to write this morning. I'm grateful for Emerson's sheer joy at calling me over on our walk this morning to tell me about the water droplets that he had found in the grass. I'm grateful for the sunshine that I felt on my face during our family walk. I'm grateful for the view out of my office window. I'm grateful for the chance to be together here today. Please do the same. 3 to 5 things for which you are grateful. They don't have to be big things, they can be small things. Laughter is a wonderful way to increase positive affect. If you haven't seen the Kaminsky Method on Netflix, it is worth binge watching, and there are many, many other shows, of course. When we were originally talking about scheduling the webinar today, the first day we discussed was tomorrow, and then I asked that we have the webinar today. It's April Fool's Day. There will be another April Fool's Day. It is coming. It will be here, and it's important to laugh in the interim. What I'd like you to do, please, is to chime in with any suggestions for how you've been staying connected. Another key resilience strategy. Suggestions, please, for how you've been staying connected during this difficult time. Family get-togethers via Zoom. Excellent. Excellent. Text and FaceTime, texting friends, group Zooms, walking with my dog and child, using social networking. I'm going to offer 10 suggestions for ways that we can stay connected to build on what you're already doing. The first are text and group text and video chat, as we've just been mentioned. If you participate in a men's group or a women's group, make it a virtual group. I was just invited to a virtual cocktail where we will FaceTime and sit in our backyards. In fact, the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine is having a virtual happy hour, noticed as BYOB, cleverly, by one of my colleagues. Last Friday, after a long week at home, my wife set up in our neighborhood a toast to the new normal, where we met and stayed socially distanced, and people had Pellegrino or a glass of wine or whatever it was that they chose to have. And frankly, we got to spend 45 minutes with our neighbors, which was kind of nice. Phone relatives. We have started a family history project with Emerson that is just sort of gathering steam, where he came up with questions and is calling relatives to ask them about their history and our family history. Write and send a letter. If you haven't done this recently, it's a wonderful way to stay connected. Check in and support your colleagues. If you feel alone, contact your local church. They will be setting up virtual functions. And even if you have to, do not isolate. This is a time to stay connected. We've talked a bit about perspective. We've talked a bit about taking care of yourself in physical, mental, emotional, and social domains. Now I'd like to talk about continuing our important work and managing your life during this time. I'd like you to think of the 4 key areas, the broadest buckets that you can think of in your life. What's important to you? And I'll give you an example. For me, this has to do these days primarily with research kinds of activities focused on telehealth and remote monitoring, research kinds of activities focused on big data analytics and value-based sleep or sleep health economics. This is also a year where we have identified getting the word out about the good work that we do as a priority, and I prioritize my personal time and my family time very much. It takes more and more to get me interested in traveling, even though I like traveling and I like seeing people. These are the 4 areas that are important to me. What are the 4 areas that are important to you? Now, when we have lots of tasks, first two questions that I want to encourage to ask are, does this need to be done at all? And who else can do it? Because we are not best at every task on our to-do list. I also want to ask, does this task move the needle to advance one of these four key areas that we've just identified as really what's important to us? And then finally, if it meets the first criteria that I need to do this, that it's important, that it fits in one of my four priority sweet spots, now I want to break it down and look at, well, who's asking and when is it due and how can I chunk similar tasks? Okay, how to stay productive at home. Maintain a consistent schedule. The Sleep Research Society sent out some tidbits recently regarding circadian rhythmicity. Keep it simple. Up at the same time, winding down at the same time. Be comfortable. Make sure your office chair is comfortable. Make sure you're well stocked with your favorite kinds of food. Clarify the purpose of your time. Is it high productivity time? Is it task time where you can have your email on? Or is it non-work time? Not all day, every day should be spent with the same degree of focus or engagement. When you are in a peak productivity time, turn off email. It can wait, and take regular breaks. You're going to need to adjust. We're all going to need to adjust what's reasonable, because some of our energy is being sucked up by COVID. So prioritize your highest priorities. Spring forward. It's not just come back, bounce back. It's also how do we focus on springing forward. The AASM and other societies, perhaps your institution, have really assembled robust resources to mitigate the effects of COVID-19 on your business and on yourself. I no longer run a sleep disorder center, but if I were running a sleep disorder center, I certainly would be writing an article for the local paper on the relationship between sleep and crisis. Host a free webinar for your patients. Send out a press release. Make yourself available. If you haven't already, start a newsletter or a blog. These are all things that you can be doing because things will get better, and it's incumbent on all of us to be prepared for that time. In summary, these are challenging times, and we need to be prepared not only to bounce back, but also to spring forward and improve our condition and the condition of our field. In order to do that, we need to maintain perspective, we need to take care of ourselves, and we need to stay engaged. I'm delighted to be with you today, and Thomas, if you want to step in, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wickwire, for this great presentation. For those of you who are with us, I encourage you to use the Q&A feature in the webinar platform to submit your questions now. Dr. Wickwire, I'll get us started with a couple. We had one participant ask if some level of anxiety may actually be helpful for success. What are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely. So the key is to find our stress sweet spot and to be able to turn it on and off. We've been largely discussing distress today, or positive stress, but there's a counterpart to distress, which is called eustress. In other words, if you think about a red, yellow, green scale, where at one end I'm asleep and at another end I'm paralyzed with fright, peak performance happens somewhere in the middle. And that's slightly variable for each of us. From a resilience perspective, the key is how do we increase our stress tolerance? And we increase our stress tolerance by intentionally focusing on periods of stress and intentionally focusing on periods of rest. After all, it's not at the gym when your muscles grow stronger, it's during sleep when your muscles grow stronger. So this is why it's so helpful to focus on those boundaries and to be clear about, is this an hour for performance or is this an hour for rest? We want to be able to fully engage and fully disengage on demand.
Great. We do have a couple more questions that have come in addressing that topic of sleep. So first, can stress and anxiety lead to fragmented sleep, especially in the early morning hours? And then also just tips for any of those doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals who really are on the front lines dealing with COVID-19, dealing with sleep deprivation. How can they respond positively to that lack of sleep they're experiencing right now?
I'll address the second question first. If you have a family, your current work is a family affair. If you don't have a family, your work colleagues are your family. We need to be pitching in and supporting frontline providers. If you're a frontline provider, ask for help and clear your plate of every non-essential task. Those are my strategies. So again, it comes back to delegating and discarding, or discarding and delegating. What can I stop doing right now, and who can I ask for help? In terms of the first question regarding stress and anxiety, absolutely. Absolutely, anxiety and stress can fragment sleep, and part of what is important for all of us is to maintain healthy rhythms right now, maintain healthy daily rhythms, healthy biorhythms, not only to prevent the onset of depression or chronic anxiety, but also so that we can be flexible and poised to spring forward.
An interesting question here from someone who is having to work from home right now and may be struggling, and I'm sure others may be struggling with that home office balance, especially the children at home as well and homeschooling as well. That structure is difficult for them to put in place right now. So any suggestions on how they can help develop some kind of structure in that home office, homeschool environment right now?
I did get a funny text yesterday. I was communicating with an old friend that I hadn't spoken to prior to COVID-19 in months or years. And we were checking in on exactly this issue. How are you managing? And his text message to me said, it's my third day of homeschool. All the kids have now graduated. I am done. So there is this sense of challenge. And if you have multiple children and they're all in the same space, it's very easy to see how that becomes a stressful situation. What we have focused on is rhythm. So we have morning walks, we have afternoon wiffle ball practice. We, as a family, have tried to start cooking things that maybe we don't normally have time to cook. And then we use a checklist. Now, our son's 6.5, and so this may or may not apply to everybody. Emerson very much wanted to watch Empire Strikes Back, which is a little too mature for a 6-year-old, but it was a great carrot under the current circumstances. So we have a checklist. Every day he has addition cards, subtraction cards, reading cards. He has, Emerson is very artistic, he has an art studio, so he has an art activity, and each day he needs to earn his checks, and then he earns rewards, and that's been great. The other thing is, it's a great time to own Lego stock. I think Lego's private, but Legos have been a very helpful approach for us as well.
What about any advice for someone who lives alone and is struggling with loneliness right now? Maybe they don't have family they're connected with. You know, this is bringing a lot of families closer together, but for people who are alone, maybe it's increasing feelings of loneliness. So how can they respond to that?
I really appreciate that question because the person who's feeling alone is not alone. We're socially distanced. By definition, we are we're not as connected as we once were. And if at the outset someone was feeling alone or lonely or disconnected, then it's been even that much more difficult. So I think I would go back to the idea generating, the possibility generating exercise that we talked about earlier. And I would try to come up with as many possible strategies that would help me feel less alone as I could think of. And if you call your local house of worship and tell them I'm feeling lonely and like I don't have a community, they will have suggestions and they will welcome you. This is an intellectual solution, and intellectual solutions don't help solve emotional problems. But the fact is that you are not alone. There are lots of people who are feeling just the same way you are now. So particularly if you're recognizing the fact that you're feeling alone or lonely or more alone and lonely than you'd like to, take action. Now is the time to put the brakes on that and find connection in any way that you can.
What about from a managerial perspective? How can we offer more support for staff who may not be working right now and they are at home right now? What can managers do to offer more support to them during this time?
Be steady. Be steady, be open, be consistent, and be connected. So our job as leaders and as managers is to lead the charge, even when we have concerns ourselves. And it doesn't mean that you need to pretend that everything's A-okay, but it does mean that it's incumbent on you to steady the ship. That doesn't mean that you have to have all the answers when your employees ask you questions, but it does mean that you need to hear those questions calmly and demonstrate a steady presence. Personally, we have regular check-ins on the phone and regular video check-ins, and have actually found that there are some positives to experiencing the challenging situation together.
What about the relationship between nutrition and exercise in addition to sleep and the different strategies you described? There's a question here about the problem of stress eating. Also a question about, are there other types of nutritional supplements that people could take that would help them right now? Any thoughts about nutrition and exercise?
Yeah, what would you do if you were taking care of that champion thoroughbred? You wouldn't be feeding it Fritos and ice cream. You'd have a balanced diet. You can think about a Mediterranean diet, for example, something that's low in inflammatory properties, given all of the other inflammatory triggers these days. I'm not an expert in supplements, so I'm going to defer that one for another venue. But remember, keep it simple. Physical activity, mental clarity, positive affect, social connection. And the more that you are buffering the sorts of stress that leads to stress eating, the more that you're going to feel compelled to stress eat to begin with.
There's also a couple questions here about journaling, which is something that you discussed. One is, do you consider it a worry journal, or is that something that is positive to use the journal to write down all your worries? And then the other question, what about for people who don't routinely journal? How could they get started, or even is there a similar alternative for someone who doesn't like to journal?
Those are great questions. There's first, a worry journal is a technique that comes from the anxiety disorders literature. And in a nutshell, the idea is that if I put my worries on paper, they are less likely to be bouncing around between my ears. Now, when I use pre-sleep wind down kinds of approaches and pre-sleep journals with patients with insomnia, what I tell them is that with practice, closing the book on your day will help you draw a line in the sand. So for example, let's say that my worry was I'm not going to have enough money, or I haven't heard from my son or daughter in a couple days, or whatever it might be. If I take out a journal at 7 p.m. and I write down those thoughts, and those thoughts are still in my head at 8 p.m., so I open my journal and write them down again, and at 9 p.m. they're still in my head, so I write them down. It doesn't take very long to realize, hey, wait a second, I already put this down on paper. I don't need to be thinking about it. It'll be there waiting for me in the morning. So worry journals are used for these sorts of purposes, and they can be very, very effective. Another worry journaling kinds of technique is to schedule a time where you're going to do all your worrying and all your worry journaling for a specific 30 minutes of the day. I think all of those can be useful strategies. One of the keys is get it out of your system. And that might be talking with peers or loved ones, or texting, or Zoom, or any of the other connection strategies that we talked about earlier. It can also be simply writing it down. From personal experience, I can tell you that there's been a great deal of connection around these kinds of fears and concerns. Your friends and your coworkers are going to be very supportive and not judgmental. I received some text messages after one of our recent weekly department meetings, which are now focused on COVID-19, talking about how much they appreciated this psychological perspective being brought into the discussion, which is, of course, the perspective that I can add in a conversation among pulmonary and critical care medicine physicians. And I said, well, I said, thank you very much. I really appreciate the support and kind words. If you're alive in North America right now, you're aware of what's going on. And everybody is nodding their head and saying, yes, exactly. So my point here is, it's okay to be a little bit more vulnerable than you otherwise might, and people are going to be supportive. Certainly that's what this webinar is all about.
I want to go back to a striking statement you made early in the presentation. You said tension is the #1 performance killer. What are some steps to reduce that tension on the fly? Excuse me, for those attendees who maybe are busier now than they've ever been, there's more pressure than they've ever had at work. They're in the thick of it. What are some steps to reduce that tension on the go?
We actually went through several of them earlier, Thomas. The first is to find the tension in your body, maintain body awareness. And once I've found where the tension is, breathe it away. The second step is to name your fear, to not carry around a generalized, non-specific sense of dread. If you have specific concerns, get very clear about what those concerns are. And the third step is to recognize it's okay. Any high-level athlete, any high-performing executive or leader will tell you that everybody feels afraid. It's a normal part of the process, particularly when we're growing or being challenged, and all of us are being challenged now. It's not a sign of weakness to feel afraid. So body awareness, relax your body, recognize the fear, name the fear, and accept it. It's okay. Your job is not to not feel afraid. Your job is to continue to perform.
There's another interesting question here about journaling, and it's kind of the flip side of it. Do you recommend that people keep a gratitude journal instead of a worry journal?
Both. Both. Even after a worry journal entry, circle back to the positive.
And then for those attendees who want to share some of these lessons and these strategies with coworkers who are dealing with this stress as well, any tips on where they should start in helping their coworkers and their colleagues grapple with some of these problems?
I think that's a great question. And of course, it depends on your work environment. If you are in an institution, for example, at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, there's actually now a very broad range of resources. There are resources for managers, there are resources for employees, there are health-focused resources, healthcare provider-focused resources. So take advantage of your environmental resources. If you, for example, are not working in an institution, if you work for a small business, if you work for a sleep disorder center or a sleep lab, take advantage of what the AASM is offering. There recently has been a webinar, even just a brief video, if I'm not mistaken, that Dr. Seema Kholsa made regarding telemedicine. Obviously, there's a huge push toward telemedicine, which I think is a great thing, and in the long run will be very good for the field of sleep medicine. Take advantage of those resources. The third suggestion that I'd have is it's probably a good idea to appoint one person to collate those. Otherwise, there's just a great deal of unorganized email back and forth. We're all getting enough emails these days as it is. And so I think having one central, from a management perspective, having one central person to pull those resources together so that all of the emails come from the same person is a good idea.
Great. Well, Dr. Wickwire, we've hit the hour. Are there any closing thoughts or comments you want to share with our attendees?
Maintain perspective, take care of yourself, and stay engaged. I really, again, am deeply grateful to the AASM for bringing this all together. To Steve for greenlighting the idea, Thomas and Kathleen and everyone on the IT side, and for everyone who's joined us today. Stay safe and stay positive.
Dr. Wickwire, thank you so much for this timely presentation and discussion. We really appreciate all that you had to share with us today.
It's my pleasure.
As a reminder, the recording of this presentation will be made available for free on the Academy website at aasm.org. If you have any questions about today's webinar, please reach out to us at education@aasm.org. And this concludes the Self-Care for Sleep Professionals webinar. Thank you for joining us.